A racist cop has a tense confrontation with a black man outside an upscale store. The situation escalates quickly, ending with the cop punching and arresting the man. But then, the officer realizes who he just attacked and arrested. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more exciting content. David Parker, a black mayor of a major city, stood outside an upscale store late one evening. The city had quieted down, and the upscale neighborhood was silent, with only the streetlights casting a soft glow on the sidewalk. David was dressed sharply in a suit after a long evening meeting and was waiting for his assistant, Robert, to pick him up. The store he stood by had been closed for a long time, and the darkened glass reflected his lonely figure. David checked his phone, growing more impatient as Robert was late again. He leaned lightly against the store's glass door, eyes scanning the empty street, hoping to spot the headlights of a car. As he gazed into the quiet night, the sound of heavy footsteps pulled him back to reality. "Hey, what are you doing here?" A stern voice suddenly shattered the silence. David looked up to see a white police officer, Officer John Wallace, approaching with suspicious eyes. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, close to his baton, as if preparing for a confrontation. Wallace's sharp gaze scanned David from head to toe, as if assessing a potential threat. David recognized the stance. It wasn't unfamiliar to him. As a black man in a position of power, he had often faced the prejudiced looks and treatment simply because of the color of his skin. He had prepared himself for moments like this, but it still unsettled him every time it happened. "What are you doing here?" Wallace asked again, his tone sharper this time, as if asserting that David was doing something wrong. David straightened up, put his phone in his pocket, and calmly responded, "I'm just waiting for someone." The officer stopped a few steps from David, his eyes still brimming with suspicion as he glanced around the empty street. "Waiting for someone at this hour here in front of a closed store?" Wallace questioned, his voice more interrogative than concerned. "Yes," David replied calmly. "My car is running late." Officer Wallace stared at David, his hand now nearly touching the baton on his belt. "Doesn't seem normal. You sure you're not lurking around here up to something?" David felt frustration building in his chest, but kept his face neutral. "I'm not lurking. I'm just standing here waiting for my ride, nothing more." Wallace smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. "Standing there in that suit, huh? Trying to make yourself look important?" David met Wallace's gaze, sensing the insult but maintaining a calm tone. "I'm just waiting for my car, officer. Nothing else is happening here." Wallace stepped closer to David, the space between them growing increasingly tense. "I don't think so. You don't belong around here. Standing alone in the middle of the night. You sure you're not planning something?" David felt his heartbeat quicken, but he knew he had to manage the situation carefully. He had been in scenarios where no explanation mattered, where prejudice and lack of control spoke louder than truth. "No need for accusations," David said, trying to keep his voice steady yet firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I already told you, I'm waiting for my car." Wallace remained motionless, his sharp eyes locked on David, seemingly waiting for something. "Do you have any ID?" Wallace asked authoritatively. David clenched his jaw but didn't let his anger show. "I don't need to give you ID when I haven't done anything wrong." Wallace's eyes darkened, his hand moving closer to his belt. "You don't get to decide that. When I ask for ID, you show it. Or are you hiding something?" David took a deep breath, trying to suppress the anger rising in his chest. "I've made it clear what I'm doing here. That should be enough. There's no need to escalate this." Wallace moved closer, the space between them now just inches. "I'm the one who decides how far this goes, not you," Wallace said in a low, threatening tone. "And right now, you're giving me plenty of reasons to dig deeper." David stood his ground, his gaze steady but his body tense, knowing this wouldn't end easily. In the stillness of the night, with the streetlights casting long shadows, the confrontation between the two men grew more tense and unpredictable. The tension between the two men escalated with each passing second. Officer Wallace's eyes no longer held mere suspicion. They now displayed a clear intention: control. He was trying to force David to submit to his authority, but David understood that if he gave in without just cause, he would be supporting the injustice and discrimination he had faced all his life. "I've already told you," David repeated, his voice low but clear. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't need to show my ID. I'm just waiting for my car." Wallace shook his head slightly, his smile fading, replaced by determination. "You don't get to make that decision. When I ask for ID, you show it. That's the law. Or are you hiding something?" David sighed internally. He had encountered these situations before, moments where explanations held no weight and everything revolved around who held the power. But this time, he knew he had to be more careful. He wasn't just any citizen. He was the mayor of the city. And because of that, he couldn't let himself be drawn into an unnecessary confrontation, especially when he knew prejudice and unchecked authority were shaping the moment. "I've made it clear," David said, his eyes not leaving Wallace's. "I'm just standing here waiting for my car. There's no need for baseless accusations. You don't have any legitimate reason to ask for my ID." But Officer Wallace didn't back down. He took another step closer to David, now only inches apart. Wallace's hand was even closer to his belt, where his handcuffs and baton hung. The air between them thickened as if every word could ignite a confrontation. "You don't belong here," Wallace hissed. "Standing here in the middle of the night, wearing that suit in front of a closed store. You sure you're not plotting something?" David could sense Wallace losing control. The frustration that had been simmering inside David now surged to the surface. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but the blatant injustice of the situation. Even so, he kept his calm, knowing that any misstep could send the situation spiraling out of control. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else," David said, his voice now sharper. "I told you I'm just waiting for my car, nothing else." Wallace's mocking smile reappeared. "Sure, I hear that story all the time. You standing here doesn't make sense, and I don't think you belong here." David closed his eyes briefly to keep his frustration from boiling over. He had been through many situations where he was treated unfairly, but this one felt different. This officer wasn't just suspicious of him. He was trying to force David, trying to turn him into a criminal in his own eyes simply because of his skin color. "Then listen closely," David said, his voice growing colder. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not a criminal, and you don't have any reason to interrogate me like this. If you have a legitimate reason, say it. Otherwise, let me be." Wallace took another step forward, now face to face with David. "I don't believe a word you're saying," he said, his voice full of provocation. "You think you can stand here and avoid answering me? I'm the one in charge here, not you." David clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure. He knew the situation was escalating unnecessarily, and one small misstep could send everything out of control. "I don't have to explain anything further to you," David said, his voice starting to edge with sharpness. "If I've done something wrong, prove it. Otherwise, you're just bullying me because you think you can." Wallace gritted his teeth, his eyes filled with anger. "Careful with your words, you're very close to crossing the line." "Which line?" David responded, his voice challenging but still calm. "The line where you'll use your power to force me off a public sidewalk?" The officer glared at David, his hand already on the handcuffs. The tension in the air was thick enough that it seemed a single move could ignite it. David knew he couldn't let the situation deteriorate further, but he also couldn't yield to the abuse of power. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Wallace said, his voice full of malice. "You think you can talk to me like that? I'm the one with authority here, not you." David stared back at Wallace, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Authority doesn't give you the right to harass someone without cause." Wallace stepped even closer, almost touching David's face. "I don't need a reason," he said, his voice full of menace. "If I feel threatened, I have the right to handle it my way. And right now, I don't like the way you're talking to me." David knew things were spiraling out of control. Wallace was no longer just a cop interrogating him. He was looking to provoke, and David had to be careful. "I'm not threatening you," David said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just standing here unarmed waiting for my car, and you're the one threatening me." The situation continued to grow more tense, and David could feel that with one wrong word or action, things could escalate to a point of no return. But David wasn't one to easily accept injustice. And even though this moment was becoming dangerous, he knew he had to stand his ground. The tension between the two men reached a boiling point. Officer Wallace made no move to back down. His aggression was becoming more evident by the minute. His hand hovered on his handcuffs, as if waiting for a single signal to arrest David. David felt the situation slipping out of control. Despite his best efforts to remain calm and reasonable, Wallace seemed determined to view David as a threat. "You're pushing your limits," Wallace said, his voice growing colder. "I'm not asking again. Hand over your ID, or I'm going to arrest you for resisting a police officer." David tried to take a deep breath to maintain his calm, but this time, he felt the situation had already crossed the line of normalcy. He looked straight into the officer's eyes, his hands still motionless. "I told you already," he said, his voice still steady but resolute. "I don't need to show you ID because I haven't done anything wrong. You're harassing me without cause." That sent Wallace over the edge. "Well, good then, you've just crossed your limit," he growled before lunging at David. Without further warning, Wallace grabbed David's wrist and yanked him, pulling him towards the store's glass door. The sudden pull caught David off guard, causing him to stumble and slam into the glass door with enough force to make it rattle. His shoulder struck the cold, hard surface, pain shooting through his arm and chest. "What are you doing?" David shouted, feeling anger boiling inside him, but still trying to avoid reacting too strongly. "Shut up," Wallace shouted, trying to spin David around, pressing his face against the glass. "You've crossed the line, and now you're going to learn what the law is." David tried to stay calm, but the feeling of helplessness and injustice made it hard. He never imagined that simply waiting for his car in front of a store could lead to this. He felt Wallace's strength as the officer pinned him against the glass, his hand reaching for the cuffs. "I told you I didn't do anything wrong," David yelled, trying to pull his arm from Wallace's grip, but keeping his movements controlled to avoid being accused of resisting arrest. "You dare resist me?" Wallace hissed, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you're above the law? Let me show you who's in charge here." Without hesitation, Wallace shoved David again, this time with enough force to pin his shoulder and face against the glass. David winced in pain, feeling the ache spread from his shoulder to his arm. But before he could say anything further, Wallace raised his hand, and with a sudden punch struck David square in the face. The punch was brutal and violent, sending David's head snapping to the side, his vision momentarily blacking out as the pain exploded from his jaw to his temple. The world spun around him, and David had to fight to stay on his feet. For a brief moment, David stood dazed, trying to regain his balance. He touched his cheek, where the sharp sting of the punch throbbed. Anger and helplessness flooded his mind. "You can't do this," David yelled, trying to keep his voice from cracking under the pain that overwhelmed him. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Wallace didn't stop. He grabbed David again, this time more forcefully, pulling him down to the sidewalk. David stumbled, trying not to fall entirely, but the pain from the punch and the anger prevented him from reacting normally. Wallace had decided that David was guilty, and he was willing to use any means to prove it. "You just crossed your final line," Wallace said, his voice now cold and unchecked. He pushed David to the ground, pinning his wrist and locking it in the cold steel handcuffs. The cuffs clicked into place with a sharp sound, and David felt the cold metal bite into his skin. "Now you're going to learn to obey the law." David lay on the ground, panting, as the pain spread through his body. The injustice of the moment burned inside him like a raging fire. He couldn't believe that waiting for a car had led to him being handcuffed and assaulted by those who were supposed to uphold justice. "You're going to regret this," David said, his voice steady and unwavering despite the pain. Even in this desperate situation, he knew he held a truth Officer Wallace was unaware of. "No, you're the one who's going to regret it," Wallace scoffed, thinking he still held control of the situation. "You'll find out you're not above the law." David gasped for air, his mind starting to clear after the punch. Despite being beaten and unlawfully arrested, he held on to one thought. His real power had yet to be revealed. He had a card left to play, and that moment would force Officer Wallace to face the true consequences of his actions. Looking at Wallace with cold eyes, David spoke, "Before you throw me in the back of your squad car, why don't you try checking my ID?" Wallace paused, his hands ready to shove David into the car, suddenly stopping. "What?" the officer asked, suspicion flickering in his eyes. David looked directly at Wallace, his voice now calm and full of confidence. "Check my ID. It's in my wallet. You're going to want to know who you just arrested before you take this any further." Wallace hesitated, his face showing signs of confusion and worry. "You had all night to give me your ID. Why now?" David kept his gaze steady, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I told you already. Check it. You won't want to throw me in that car before you know who you're dealing with." David's confidence seemed to make Wallace falter. No longer as aggressive, Wallace reached into David's pocket, pulled out his wallet, and opened it. His rough fingers pulled out the ID card. When Wallace looked at it, his face suddenly turned pale, the color draining as the words on the card became clear. "Mayor David Parker." Officer Wallace stood frozen, his eyes glued to the ID card in his hand. The smugness and aggression that had filled him moments before vanished, replaced by panic. Everything seemed to pause in that moment, as Wallace realized the man he had just assaulted and arrested was none other than Mayor David Parker, the head of the city. "Mayor," Wallace stammered, his eyes still fixed on the card. I didn't know." David, despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder and the burning sting on his face from the punch, remained calm. He slowly stood upright, pushing past the pain as he looked Wallace straight in the eye. "That's right, I'm the mayor," David said, his voice clear and authoritative, "and you've just made a very serious mistake." Wallace stood frozen, his hands still trembling as he held the ID card. His gaze flickered nervously, his confidence from earlier completely shattered. He couldn't believe what had just happened. "Sir, I didn't know you were the mayor. I didn't mean..." He hurriedly fumbled for his keys, awkwardly unlocking David's handcuffs, his hands shaking so much he nearly dropped the key. David kept his cold gaze on Wallace, feeling the relief as the cuffs were removed. He rubbed his wrists, swollen from the tight grip of the metal, but his voice remained steady. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to check. You let your prejudice and assumptions dictate your actions." Wallace stepped back, fear now evident in his eyes. "Sir, I didn't think..." he stammered, searching for an excuse but finding none. David cut him off, his tone calm but sharp. "That's the problem. You didn't think. You saw me and immediately assumed I was a threat. You didn't care what I had to say, no matter how clear I was. All you cared about was my skin color and the fact that I was standing here in a place you thought I didn't belong." Wallace took another step back, his face flushed red, but not from anger, from shame. "Sir, I didn't mean... I was just doing my job." "Punching me in the face is doing your job?" David asked, his voice growing colder. "Using violence and handcuffing someone without just cause is doing your job? Or is that just an excuse for your racism and abuse of power?" The officer had nothing left to say. He couldn't defend himself, couldn't explain, because any justification was meaningless in the face of the obvious truth. Wallace's eyes flickered with fear, and he couldn't even look David in the eyes anymore. He knew his career, perhaps his entire life, had changed in this single moment. "Sir, I'm sorry," Wallace stuttered, his regret clear on his face. "I truly didn't mean..." David interrupted again, his voice full of authority. "Sorry isn't enough. You abused your power. You let your bias dictate your actions. You thought you could behave like this and face no consequences. Wallace took another step back, his face drained of all color. Sir, please, I'll lose my job. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean... David didn't flinch. You shouldn't. I'd have to know who I am to treat me with basic respect and fairness. That's what every citizen deserves from the police force. Wallace stood still, unable to say anything. He knew he had made a grave mistake, and no words could fix the situation now. David rubbed his injured wrists, his gaze still locked on Wallace. I want your badge number right now, David said coldly. Wallace hurriedly provided the number, his hands shaking as he wrote it down. David entered the badge number into his phone, not taking his eyes off Wallace. You'll be hearing from me soon, David said firmly, and next time you won't get off this easily. With that, David turned and walked away, leaving Officer Wallace standing there in a state of fear and regret. Though David had just been through a violent and unjust ordeal, he didn't let anger consume him. He knew that this incident was about more than just him. It was about a larger issue, a broken policing system, about power and bias, and about the changes that needed to be made. As David walked quickly out of the quiet street, the streetlights casting shadows along the sidewalk, he pulled out his phone and called his assistant, Robert. Robert, David said, his voice serious and urgent. Meet me at City Hall now, we have work to do. Without waiting for Robert to respond, David hung up, his eyes focused forward, his mind already set on what needed to be done next. This wasn't just a confrontation with an officer abusing his power. It was the moment to push for real change. And David knew he had the power to make it happen. This story doesn't end with the injustice David just faced. This is the beginning of a larger battle to reform and fix the systemic issues in the city's police force. David walked with purpose, leaving Officer Wallace standing frozen in fear and panic. The officer's face still pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. David didn't look back, but he knew Wallace was standing there, feeling the weight of the consequences he would soon face. The injustice had unfolded right before David's eyes, and now it was time for him to turn his anger into concrete action. As David stepped out of the quiet street, his mind raced with thoughts of how this incident could spark a change in the city. This wasn't the first time he had encountered racism, but this time, he was determined not to let it end with just his own personal experience. As mayor, he knew he had a responsibility to ensure that incidents like this wouldn't happen again to anyone else. By the time he arrived at City Hall, Robert was already waiting, his face filled with concern. David, what happened? I heard your voice on the phone and I was worried. David sighed, rubbing his sore wrists where the cuffs had been too tight, then said, I was just assaulted and unlawfully arrested by a cop simply because I was standing on a sidewalk waiting for my car. Robert froze, his face going pale. What? What are you talking about? How could that happen to the mayor? David looked at Robert, his eyes filled with determination. Yes, and that's the issue. This happened not because of who I am, but because I'm a black man standing in a wealthy neighborhood. Wallace, the cop, didn't bother to check or listen. He just saw my skin color and decided I was a threat. This isn't just about me anymore, Robert. This is a system full of prejudice and abuse of power, and I'm not going to let it go. Robert stared at David, his face a mix of anger and concern. So what are you going to do? David answered firmly, We're going to act. I got the cop's badge number, and the first step is filing a formal complaint, but this is just the beginning. I'm going to make sure this case is public, and that officer is held accountable. Not only that, but I'm pushing for deep reforms in the police system. Robert nodded, a look of determination growing on his face as well. I'll help you. This can't just be a personal complaint. David nodded, his eyes resolute. Exactly, we need to take this higher. We're going to file this with the police department and the chief of police, and if they don't handle it transparently, I'm going to bring it to the public. The whole city needs to know about this. This isn't a small issue, and it's not going to be brushed under the rug. Immediately, Robert and David began to work. They gathered all the evidence from David's ID, the details of Officer Wallace, and a full description of the incident. David prepared a file to submit the formal complaint, but he knew this couldn't just be dealt with through an internal investigation. He needed more. A few hours later, the official complaint was submitted to the police department, but David didn't stop there. He knew that if it was handled internally, there was a risk it could get swept under the rug. So his next move was to meet directly with the city's chief of police, Chief Harrison. The next day, David arrived at the police station with Robert by his side. Both of them had serious looks on their faces. As they walked in, the officers immediately recognized David, and there was an awkward silence as they noticed the faint bruise on his face. A receptionist stood up when she saw David approach. "I need to speak with Chief Harrison," David said shortly, his tone leaving no room for doubt that he was demanding justice. The receptionist quickly nodded and made a call inside. A few minutes later, Chief Harrison, a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression, appeared in the hallway, walking towards David with a tense look on his face. "Mayor Parker," Harrison said, his voice calm but clearly uneasy. "We should talk in my office." David said nothing, just nodded, and followed Harrison into the office. When the door closed behind them, Harrison sighed and sat down behind his desk. "I've heard about what happened last night. This is a very serious situation." David didn't sit. He stood tall, looking Harrison straight in the eye. "Yes, it is. And I'm not here just to talk. I'm demanding a formal investigation into the actions of Officer Wallace. He abused his power and acted with clear racial bias. I won't let this be swept under the rug or handled quietly behind closed doors." Harrison took a deep breath, his eyes betraying his tension. "I understand, and I'm committed to handling this seriously. Officer Wallace has already been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation." David showed neither satisfaction nor displeasure. "I'm not here for a suspension. I want to ensure this incident is handled publicly, transparently, and that any wrongdoing is dealt with harshly. This isn't just a personal issue, it's a systemic problem, and if the system can't fix itself, I'll make sure it's taken before the entire public." Harrison looked at David for a long moment before nodding, his voice lowering. "I understand, you have my word. We will not hide anything, and any misconduct will be dealt with appropriately." David finally sat down, his eyes never leaving the chief's. "I hope you keep your word, because if not, I'll use every tool I have, not just as mayor, but as a citizen demanding justice." Harrison remained silent, then nodded. "I understand." The meeting ended quickly, but David knew it was just the beginning. The fight for justice and system reform had begun, and he wasn't going to stop until everything was fixed. After meeting with Chief Harrison, David walked out of the police station with a sense of determination, mixed with caution. He knew that Harrison's promise might not be enough. This wasn't just a personal matter with one officer, it was a systemic issue, and the system had avoided change for far too long. David needed to ensure that this promise would be fulfilled, and he knew he would face many obstacles ahead. A few days later, a critical meeting was held at City Hall, attended by key leaders, Chief Harrison, representatives from the police union, and senior city officials. David entered the meeting room as a leader, but this time he wasn't just representing himself, he was representing the entire community, those who had been treated unjustly like him. The room fell silent as he entered, all eyes drawn to the faint bruise on his face. David sat at the head of the table, facing Harrison and the police representatives. Harrison sat sternly, trying to maintain his composure, but tension was evident in his eyes. The police union members sat across from David, their eyes defensive, especially given what David had just gone through. The meeting began with formalities and an official report from Chief Harrison on the status of the investigation into Officer Wallace. "Wallace has been suspended, and we're conducting a thorough investigation. I assure you the process will be transparent," Harrison stated, trying to maintain a professional tone. David leaned forward, his eyes cold and determined. "I'm not sitting here to hear about one officer's suspension. We can't address this issue by handling one individual without addressing the entire system. Now is the time for concrete action and reform of our police force. One of the police union representatives, a tall man with a scowling face, spoke up. "Mr. Mayor, we respect the investigative process, but let's be clear. That officer was only doing his duty. If we're not careful, targeting individuals could weaken the morale of the entire police force." David remained silent for a moment, but his gaze sharpened. "Are you telling me that beating and unlawfully arresting someone is doing his duty?" he asked, his tone strong and unyielding. "If that's true, then we clearly have a more severe problem than we thought. That officer didn't just make a personal mistake. He acted based on a system that allows and encourages abuse of power and racial bias." The police union was clearly challenged by David's firm words. "Mr. Mayor, we don't deny that everything needs to be investigated thoroughly, but there has to be balance. Pushing through strong reforms could create a backlash within the police force." David frowned, knowing that this was the kind of resistance he would face not only from the union, but also from the top levels of the police force. Backlash doesn't come from reform, it comes from the lack of accountability. If our police force feels threatened by demands for transparency and justice, that's the problem. And I won't let this city continue to tolerate that. Chief Harrison remained silent for a moment, then spoke up. "I agree that change is necessary, but this process takes time. Large-scale reforms will meet strong resistance, not just from the union, but also from officers within the force. We can't change a system overnight." David leaned back in his chair, his tone sharpening. "I'm not asking for overnight change, but we can't delay forever. The time for action is now. I've waited long enough, and so has the community. If there's no concrete action, I will bring this issue to the public." The tension in the room heightened as the city officials, officers, and union representatives realized that David was unyielding. He wasn't just a mayor seeking personal justice. He was representing an entire community demanding change. What happened to him was only a symptom of what many others had experienced silently, and David had no intention of letting this continue. "So what do we do next?" David asked, his eyes scanning the room. "Reform isn't optional, it's mandatory. If we don't fix this system from the ground up, we'll lose public trust forever." A few city officials who had been quietly listening began nodding in agreement. They knew that David's words carried weight, not just morally, but politically. Protests could erupt at any moment if the people felt the system wasn't protecting their rights. And if reform didn't happen, the city could face an even greater crisis. The meeting continued with concrete proposals. David demanded the creation of an independent oversight committee to investigate police misconduct, as well as mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation for all officers. These were the first steps in a long and difficult process to reform the entire system. Despite some resistance, Chief Harrison eventually agreed that these measures were necessary. "I'll work with the leadership of the force and the union to implement these reforms. We need to ensure that this system no longer tolerates abuse of power." David nodded but knew this was only the beginning. "Good," he said firmly. "But remember, if there's no progress, I won't hesitate to bring this issue to the entire city. And then there will be no turning back for anyone." The meeting ended with a temporary consensus, but David knew that the real battle for change was still ahead. The reforms would face strong opposition from those unwilling to change, and the process would not be easy. But now, with his position, David was prepared to fight to bring justice and transparency to the city's police force. As he stepped out of the meeting room, Robert walked beside him, quietly asking, "What do you think? Will they really change?" David sighed but kept his determination. "They'll have to. We won't give them any other option." After the meeting with city leaders, David knew that the real fight was just beginning. Even though Chief Harrison and the police union had agreed to the proposed reforms, David understood that there would be resistance and obstruction from within the system that didn't want to change. The promises made in the meeting room would be just empty words without real action. The next day, David held a press conference at City Hall. he decided to make the incident and the proposed reforms public to ensure that no one could deny or ignore them. In front of City Hall, reporters and citizens gathered in large numbers, waiting to hear from the mayor, who had just experienced a brutal and unjust incident at the hands of the city's own police force. David stepped up to the podium, his face resolute and determined. Below him, reporters raised their cameras and notepads, ready to capture his every word. The sunlight hit his face, highlighting the bruise on his cheek, a stark reminder of what had happened. "Good afternoon," David began, his voice loud and strong. "I stand before you today not only as the mayor of this city, but as a citizen of it, someone who has experienced firsthand the injustice of the very system we are trying to improve." The crowd grew silent, every word David spoke drawing their full attention. "A few days ago, I was assaulted and arrested by a police officer simply because I was standing on a sidewalk waiting for my car. This is not just a personal incident, it's a reflection of a much larger systemic problem. A problem where prejudice and abuse of power have become so ingrained that even someone like me, the mayor of this city, can be treated this way." David paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the tension and outrage spread through the crowd, as they understood that if this could happen to the mayor, it could happen to anyone. "But I'm not here just to talk about that incident," David continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm here to talk about change. We cannot just look at one officer and think that's the issue. The issue lies in the entire system, and that's why my administration and the city leaders have decided that now is the time for action." David turned to look directly into the cameras, as if speaking to every citizen in the city through their screens. "We are going to establish an independent oversight committee to investigate all claims of police misconduct. This committee will not be part of any police organization, and they will have access to all documents and information. No more will incidents be covered up or handled internally in a shady manner." A small round of applause broke out from those gathered, but David stayed focused, knowing his message needed to continue. "We will also mandate that all officers in this city undergo training on de-escalation and anti-racism. This won't just be a surface-level course, but a part of their annual training. Every officer will need to better understand the community they serve, and they will be held accountable for every action they take." Louder applause began to fill the air as the crowd responded to David's strong stance. He could feel the support, knowing he was saying exactly what so many people had been waiting to hear. "And finally," David said, his voice growing even stronger, "we will make public all complaints about police misconduct, along with updates on the investigation. No longer will these issues be hidden or handled behind closed doors. The people of this city deserve to know that their police force is working to protect them, not to threaten or harm them." The applause and cheers swelled throughout the crowd. David knew that these reforms weren't just promises, they were concrete steps toward changing the entire system. But he also understood this was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be long and difficult. Following the press conference, the public's response became clear. Social media exploded with hashtags about police reform, with many people voicing their support for the changes David proposed. Civil rights organizations and community leaders also came out strongly in favor, demanding that the city implement these measures immediately. But as David had anticipated, not everyone was happy with these proposals. The police union and some officers began publicly criticizing David's reforms. They claimed that the Independent Oversight Committee was an infringement on the authority of the police force, and that mandatory training would weaken the fighting spirit of the officers. They warned that these measures could lead to an increase in crime because officers would be hesitant to confront criminals out of fear of accountability. David knew he would face opposition. In meetings that followed with Chief Harrison and other city officials, he continued to push for the implementation of reforms. Although Harrison maintained his promise that the investigation would be handled transparently, he also cautioned that there might be internal resistance. "Mr. Mayor, I understand and agree with your proposals," Harrison said in a private meeting, "but pushing these changes will not be easy. Many officers feel threatened by the external oversight. David looked Harrison straight in the eye. "Chief, if they feel threatened by accountability, they shouldn't be in the police force. We're talking about the survival of public trust. If we don't act now, things will only get worse." Harrison remained silent, knowing there was no valid excuse. He understood that what David said was true, and despite his concerns about the response from his officers, he also knew the current system couldn't remain as it was. In the end, the meetings concluded with a commitment to implement the reforms David proposed, but David still knew this was only the beginning. Many within the police force would continue to resist change, and the police union would likely keep making things difficult. However, David had no intention of stopping. As David and Robert left City Hall after a long day, Robert turned to him, asking with concern in his voice, "Do you think we can get through this? The pushback from the union and the force could be intense." David stared straight ahead, his eyes full of determination. "We will. This isn't just about a few small reforms. This is a fight for justice and truth, and I'm not stopping until we get it." With those words, David walked forward, knowing the battle was far from over, but ready to fight to the end to change the system entirely. After the press conferences and commitments to reform from city leadership, the opposition from the police union became more apparent than ever. They launched a public campaign against David's proposals, arguing that the creation of an independent oversight committee and mandatory anti-racism training would harm the fighting spirit of the force and weaken law enforcement. The resistance didn't stop at words. Some officers within the police force began showing their dissatisfaction more openly, even hinting at threats of a strike. They claimed that too much oversight would make it harder for them to do their jobs. The police union declared that these reforms would hurt the morale of officers and reduce the force's ability to combat crime. David, though facing major challenges, remained steadfast in his stance. He organized more meetings with community groups, listening to the voices of the people and continuing to push for the necessary changes. He realized that, to counter the resistance within the force, he needed strong support from outside, from the very people the system was supposed to serve. With the support of the community, peaceful protests and media campaigns began to spread across the city, demanding real reform in the police force. The community was no longer passive. They became David's allies in this fight. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and ordinary citizens spoke out publicly in favor of reform. The pressure from the community grew, forcing city officials and the police chief to accelerate the implementation of the agreed-upon measures. Throughout this process, David didn't waver in the face of criticism or threats from the police union. He understood that change is never easy, especially when it challenges a long-standing system filled with prejudice and unchecked power. He continued to push forward with the reforms, even knowing that this journey would face fierce opposition from those unwilling to change. The media continued to cover David's battle, highlighting both the challenges and the initial progress of implementing the reforms. The public rallied behind him, further empowering him to continue the fight. Peaceful protests grew larger, showing the city's collective determination for justice and transparency in policing. Despite the ongoing resistance, under the pressure from the community and David's unwavering determination, some of the reforms began to take shape. The Independent Oversight Committee was established, and anti-racism and de-escalation training became mandatory for all officers. The change wasn't happening quickly, but the first steps were being taken. David knew this fight was far from over. The police union and some officers continued to obstruct progress, but he believed that with strong public support and relentless pressure, the system would eventually have to change. It was a difficult journey, but he knew he was on the right path, and with his unshakable resolve, he wouldn't stop until justice was fully realized. Ultimately, though the road ahead was still full of obstacles, David could feel that his efforts were starting to make a difference. The police system, slow and fraught with difficulty, was beginning to change, and that was the first victory for him and the entire community. As time passed, The changes David and the community fought for slowly began to have a real impact. The Independent Oversight Committee began its work, and public reports on police misconduct cases were brought to light. Although the progress wasn't as fast as many had hoped, transparency and accountability had been made a priority, and this increased the public's trust in the system. Training programs on racial bias and de-escalation were also rolled out across the force. Officers who participated started to see things differently regarding how they enforced the law and interacted with the community. While there were still dissenting voices and hesitancy from some groups, David knew these were necessary steps toward rebuilding trust and creating a better police force that served all citizens equally. However, not everyone accepted the changes easily. Some veteran officers still resisted, and the police union continued to look for ways to limit the reform's impact. But with the support of the public and the media, David and the advocates for reform had created a movement that couldn't be ignored. The community became a decisive factor, and when the people stood up and demanded justice, the system had no choice but to respond. On a sunny afternoon, after another press conference announcing the progress of the reforms, David stood outside City Hall, looking out over the city. He felt a sense of change slowly taking place. He reflected on the events that had led to this moment, from his confrontation with Officer Wallace to the tense meetings with city leaders. Everything had changed since that moment, not just for him, but for the entire city. Robert walked up next to him, smiling softly. "You did it, David. Things are moving forward and people are starting to see the results." David smiled but kept his eyes focused. "Yes, but this is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done to ensure that these reforms aren't temporary. True justice isn't a destination. It's a long journey." Robert nodded. "And you'll keep leading the city on that journey." David exhaled lightly, knowing deep down that the fight for fairness and transparency was far from over. He had opened a new path, and now he wouldn't stop until every citizen, no matter their race or social status, was treated fairly under the law. This wasn't just his story, it was the story of an entire community, a city moving forward with hope and real change. "We're not going back," David said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is the only path forward, and we'll keep walking it until we achieve the justice that everyone deserves." And with those words, David stepped forward, continuing the journey, knowing that he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for a new generation who would never have to face the kind of injustice he had endured. This story wouldn't end in the present. It would continue with the lasting changes David and his community had initiated. A fairer future awaited, and David was ready to lead the city toward it. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you found this message meaningful and want to hear more stories like it, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming content. Let's spread positive and just values together. Thank you.